They said his eyes were the devil's work. In Albemarle County, Virginia in 1851, people believed many things. They believed land meant power. They believed blood meant honor. And they believed that no enslaved man should ever have eyes like his. Pale blue, cold, watching, eyes that did not belong on a man whose body was owned. Those eyes would start whispers. Those whispers would grow into fear. And fear would turn into violence so sudden and so brutal that it would stain one of Virginia's most respected families forever. Before this story ends, someone will be dead. A courtroom will be packed. And a secret buried for decades will be dragged into the light where it never should have been seen. This is the beginning of that story. In the spring of 1851, Hartwell Plantation stood quiet beneath the Blue Ridge Mountains. Nearly 800 acres of red Virginia soil stretched in perfect rows of tobacco plants. The land looked peaceful, but peace was a lie. The main house sat proudly at the end of a long oak-lined drive. White brick walls gleamed in the sun. Tall columns held up a wide porch where the Hartwell family often sat in the evenings, sipping tea and talking about politics and business. The house had been built to last. 3 generations of Hartwells had lived there. 3 generations had grown rich from that soil. And 3 generations had learned how to keep secrets. Colonel Edmund Hartwell was the current master of the estate. At 47 he was a man others listened to. His voice carried weight in county meetings. His name opened doors in Richmond. He had earned his military rank fighting in the Mexican War, and he wore that history with pride. He rode his land every morning. He inspected crops. He questioned overseers. He believed order was the foundation of civilization. His wife Catherine was admired throughout the county. She was graceful and controlled. She managed the house with precision and hosted gatherings that people talked about for weeks afterward. She smiled easily. She spoke kindly, and she never allowed her emotions to show in public. They had 3 children and a future that looked secure. On the surface, Hartwell Plantation was a symbol of Southern success. But beneath that surface something dark had been growing for years. Behind the main house stood the slave quarters. 12 wooden cabins lined up in 2 neat rows. 43 people lived there. Families, children, elders. People who worked from sunrise to sunset and owned nothing but their memories and their faith. They formed their own world away from the white family. They shared stories at night. They sang softly so the overseer would not hear. They warned each other when trouble was coming. And they talked about Daniel. Daniel was 23 years old. Strong, quiet, reliable. He worked the tobacco fields like any other man. He did not talk back. He did not cause trouble. But everyone noticed his eyes. They were not brown, not hazel, not gray. They were blue, clear and pale like winter sky. People stared. White visitors whispered. Enslaved men avoided meeting his gaze for too long. Eyes like that raised questions no one wanted answered. Some said his mother had been Irish. Others said his father was white. Some said those eyes were a sign of a curse. Daniel himself said nothing. He had been born on the plantation. His mother had died when he was young. No record existed of his father. No one asked questions because questions were dangerous. But Colonel Hartwell noticed. At first he told himself it meant nothing. Strange things happened in bloodlines. It was better not to look too closely. But the eyes followed him. In the fields, in the stables, in the shadows near the main house. Sometimes when Daniel looked at him there was something unsettling. In his expression, not anger. Not defiance, recognition. That was what disturbed Edmund Hartwell most. Then the rumors started. They moved quietly through the county, spreading from kitchen conversations to church benches to late-night whiskey sessions. People talked about the resemblance, about the shape of Daniel's face, about the way his eyes matched someone else's. Someone in the Hartwell family. Catherine heard the whispers too. She smiled politely when neighbors spoke. But at night she slept poorly. She began watching Daniel whenever he was near the house. Fear has a way of sharpening jealousy. And jealousy turns quickly into hatred. By early May tension clung to the plantation like humidity before a storm. Overseers reported arguments in the quarters. Daniel had been in a fight. Someone accused him of thinking too highly of himself. Thinking he was more than what he was. Then something happened that could not be undone. On a warm evening just before sunset, Daniel was ordered to carry crates into the storage shed near the main house. He worked alone. The air was heavy. Cicadas screamed from the trees. Colonel Hartwell followed him. No one knows exactly what was said between them. No one heard the words. But servants later reported raised voices. Anger. Fear. Moments later a single gunshot echoed across the plantation. Daniel was found lying on the dirt floor of the shed. Blood pooling beneath him. His blue eyes staring upward, frozen and unblinking. Colonel Hartwell claimed it was self-defense. The county demanded answers. And soon a courtroom would force everyone to confront the truth they had spent years denying. In the next part we will follow the investigation that tore through Albemarle County and revealed what those eyes truly meant. If this story has you hooked, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Leave a comment telling us where you are listening from. And stay with us as we uncover the darkness hiding behind the white columns of Hartwell Plantation. Part 2. Some secrets do not stay buried. They breathe, they grow, and eventually they demand blood. Daniel's eyes were not just unusual. They were dangerous. Everyone at Hartwell Plantation understood that, even if no one dared say it aloud. Those pale blue eyes were living proof of something the white world pretended did not exist. They were evidence of power abused and lines crossed that could never be uncrossed. Daniel had been born on a freezing January night in 1828. The wind howled through the cracks in the slave cabins, and the fire in Ruth's hearth burned low. The plantation midwife had delivered hundreds of babies in her lifetime, but when she wiped the blood from Daniel's face and saw his eyes, she froze. She said nothing. She did not have to. Ruth knew the moment she looked at her son. She turned her face to the wall and wept silently so no one would hear. In the quarters news traveled fast, and by morning everyone knew. They also knew the rule. Speak of it and suffer. Ruth was 19 then, too young to fight, too frightened to run. She had learned early that survival meant obedience and silence. She returned to the kitchen days later with her body aching and her heart shattered, carrying the truth inside her like a loaded gun. Years passed. Daniel grew. His eyes never darkened. They never faded. They stayed bright and unmistakable. The other children noticed first. They teased him until their parents stopped them. Adults watched him carefully. White visitors stared too long. Some looked amused. Others looked disturbed. A few looked afraid. But no one looked at him the way Catherine Hartwell did. From the moment Daniel could walk, Catherine's eyes followed him. Her hatred was cold and controlled. It was never loud, never dramatic. It lived in small punishments and sharp glances and quiet cruelty. Daniel learned quickly. He learned which corners of the yard to avoid. He learned when Catherine walked the grounds. He learned never to raise his eyes when she was near. He learned that her anger did not fade with time. It sharpened, because Daniel was not just a reminder of betrayal. He was a living mirror. To understand that hatred, you must return to the autumn of 1836, when Catherine Beaumont arrived at Hartwell Plantation as a bride. She had been 22 and full of dreams. Richmond society had admired her beauty and praised her education. She believed marriage would bring her love and purpose and status. Her wedding to Edmund Hartwell had been everything she imagined. Music echoed through St. Paul's Episcopal Church. Silk rustled. Glasses clinked. She had smiled until her cheeks hurt. When she arrived at Hartwell Plantation, she expected a fairy tale. What she found was isolation. The house was grand but lonely. The halls echoed at night. The servants moved with confidence that unsettled her. They knew the rhythms of the place better than she did. They watched her closely. Edmund was distant, not cruel, not unkind, just absent. His mind lived in fields and ledgers and markets. He treated Catherine with politeness instead of passion. Loneliness crept in like fog. Then came the moment that changed everything. 3 weeks after her arrival, Catherine was walking behind the main house when she saw Edmund speaking with a young kitchen slave. Ruth. Catherine did not know her name then. She only noticed how close they stood. Too close. Edmund's voice was low. Ruth's posture was not fearful. There was familiarity there. Catherine felt something cold twist in her stomach. When Edmund touched Ruth's arm, Catherine knew. That night she asked questions. Edmund gave careful answers. Too careful. His eyes avoided hers. His voice tightened. Catherine said nothing more. Then in January news reached the house. Ruth had given birth. Catherine did something she rarely did. She went to the quarters. She told herself she was curious. She told herself it was kindness. But deep down she already knew why she was there. When Ruth handed her the baby, Catherine felt her hands shake. The infant slept peacefully until Catherine whispered to him. His eyes opened. Blue. Not gray. Not light brown. Hartwell blue. Catherine felt the room spin. In that instant everything became clear. Edmund's distance. His defensiveness. His silence. Her marriage had begun with a lie. She returned to the main house and locked herself away. She did not cry loudly. She did not scream. Southern ladies did not do that. Instead she learned something far more dangerous. She learned to hate quietly. She could not confront Edmund. To do so would humiliate her. It would destroy her place in society. It would expose a truth everyone pretended not to see. She could not openly harm Ruth. That would raise questions. But she could make life unbearable. Ruth's work grew harder. Her hours longer. Mistakes that others escaped became punishable offenses. Her clothes wore thin. Her food grew scarce. Ruth endured it all in silence. As Daniel grew older, Catherine's attention shifted to him. He was assigned heavier labor early. He was punished for small things. He was watched constantly. Worst of all, he was feared. Because as Daniel matured, the resemblance became harder to deny. His height, his build, even the shape of his face echoed Edmund Hartwell. People whispered behind hands. Some laughed nervously. Others warned their children not to stare. Daniel understood without being told. He learned to shrink himself. To disappear when possible. To never draw attention. But eyes like his could never be hidden forever. By 1851 Daniel had become a man. Strong, capable, noticeable. And Catherine Hartwell had waited a long time. Her hatred had ripened into something sharp and desperate. She saw danger everywhere. Every glance Daniel made felt like a threat. Every rumor felt like exposure. The plantation itself seemed to sense the tension. The air grew heavy. Voices lowered. Even Edmund seemed uneasy, though he never spoke of it. Then came the evening when everything broke. In the next part we will witness the slow tightening of fear and jealousy that led to violence, and the moment when silence finally failed. If you are drawn to dark American history and stories the textbooks never tell, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Leave a comment telling us where you are listening from. And stay with us as Hartwell Plantation moves closer to the night that changed everything forever. Part 3. Pain teaches lessons that words never can. Daniel learned that lesson early. His first memories were not of laughter or play. They were of his mother's hands. Rough hands. Scarred hands. Hands burned by hot iron pots and cracked by cold water. Yet when those hands touched his face they were gentle. Careful. Loving in a way the world around him never was. Before sunrise Ruth would wake him. The quarters were dark and silent except for the coughs of sleepers and the creak of wood settling. They walked together to the main house while the sky was still black. Ruth went to the kitchen. Daniel sat in the corner. He learned to be invisible before he learned to read faces. He stayed quiet. He did not move unless spoken to. He learned that drawing attention was dangerous. The house slaves were kind but cautious. Old Bessie slipped him food when no one was watching. Samuel from the stables taught him how to brush horses and let him help with small chores. But there was always space between them and Daniel. They knew what his eyes meant. They knew that closeness to him could bring trouble. When Daniel turned 6 he was sent to the fields. It was early but not unusual. Children worked when they could stand and walk and follow orders. His first tasks were small. Carrying water, picking leaves, pulling weeds. The fields swallowed him. The tobacco plants rose tall and thick. Leaves clung to skin and clothing. The sun pressed down until breathing felt heavy. Sweat burned his eyes. His hands blistered and hardened. As he grew older the work grew harder. Hoeing rows until his back screamed. Cutting plants until his arms shook. Hanging leaves and curing barns where the air was thick and hot and smelled of rot and earth. Watching them all was Garrett. Garrett had been overseer since before Daniel was born. Tall and lean with a face carved by years of cruelty. He rode through the fields slowly. Watching, waiting. The whip was never far from his hand. Daniel learned to work harder than anyone else. Faster, longer. He learned to read Garrett's mood by the way he sat his horse, by the way his eyes moved. Even then it was not enough. Garrett noticed Daniel more than the others, found fault where there was none, punished mistakes others made without consequence. By his teenage years Daniel's back carried scars, lines crossing old lines. He learned to take pain without sound. Crying only brought more. But Garrett was not the worst of it. Catherine Hartwell was. Sometimes she came to the fields with her parasol held just right to shield her skin from the sun. She stood at the edge of the rows, silent, watching. Daniel felt her eyes before he saw her. She never spoke to him. She did not need to. She spoke to Garrett instead. That boy looks slow today. That row is poorly kept. I saw someone being lazy earlier. Garrett understood. Punishment followed. Daniel tried to understand why she hated him. He knew it was his eyes. He knew they marked him. But he did not fully understand until he was 15. That day Joseph worked beside him. Joseph was older, careful. He had survived by knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. Joseph saw Daniel staring at the main house where Catherine stood on the veranda. You know why she hates you, Joseph said quietly. Daniel shook his head. Joseph looked around before speaking again. Your eyes, boy. They are the master's eyes. The words settled heavy. The master is your father. Everyone knows. Can't hide eyes like that. And the mistress knows too. That's why she hates you. You remind her of what he did to your mother. Joseph turned back to his work. Daniel stood frozen. That night he asked Ruth. They sat outside their cabin eating in silence. Daniel's hands shook. Mama, is it true? He asked. Ruth froze. For a long moment she did not move. Then she looked at him. Her eyes carried years of pain and fear. Don't ask me that, she said softly. Don't ever ask me that. Some truths will get you killed. You keep your head down. You work. You survive. That is all. Daniel never asked again. Watching Edmund Hartwell with his children was another kind of torture. Margaret was closest in age to Daniel. When she was small she sometimes spoke to him with a child's careless kindness. As she grew older she learned to look past him. Ned was cruel early. He enjoyed power. He learned from his mother well. He gave orders, told lies, took pleasure in punishment. He hated Daniel without knowing fully why. Sarah was still young, too young to understand. That would change. Edmund himself was a ghost in Daniel's life. He never acknowledged him, never spoke unless forced, never held his gaze. Daniel wondered sometimes if that was mercy. The winter before the murder changed everything. Snow came early and stayed. The fields lay silent, roads vanished, the plantation was cut off. Food grew scarce, cabins froze, illness spread, old Bessie died, then Thomas. Ruth grew sick. It started with a cough, then pain, then breath that came in sharp shallow gasps. Still she worked. Catherine allowed no rest. Daniel watched his mother fade. One night Ruth collapsed in the kitchen. Catherine stood over her and said nothing. Daniel carried his mother back to the quarters himself. Ruth's breathing rattled in her chest. Daniel stayed by her side. For the first time he felt something harder than fear. Anger. The kind that grows quiet and deep. Ruth died before the snow melted. Daniel buried her with his own hands. Something broke inside him that winter. And when spring came to Hartwell Plantation the ground thawed. So did old hatred, and something dark began to move toward violence. In the next part we will see how grief turns into danger and how one quiet man became the center of a storm no one could stop. If this story has you hooked, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Leave a comment telling us where you are listening from. And stay with us as Hartwell Plantation moves closer to its breaking point. Part 4. Grief does not fade. It waits. When the snow finally melted at Hartwell Plantation, it revealed more than muddy fields and broken fences. It revealed what winter had buried inside Daniel. His mother was gone. Ruth had been the single steady thing in his life. The only voice that warned him. The only hands that comforted him. When she died, something inside Daniel went quiet and something else woke up. He still worked. He still obeyed. But he no longer feared pain the way he once had. Fear had been replaced by emptiness. The plantation returned to its usual rhythm. Tobacco seedlings were planted. Tools were repaired. Orders were barked. Catherine resumed her rounds with renewed sharpness. Daniel felt her watching him more often now. Without Ruth there was no shield between him and her cruelty. No quiet presence to absorb punishment meant for him. Catherine knew it. She began assigning him closer to the main house. More visible, more vulnerable, he worked near the storage sheds, hauled supplies, cleaned the yards, tasks that placed him directly in her line of sight. Each day felt like walking through fire. The other slaves noticed the change. Whispers followed Daniel wherever he went. Not cruel whispers, worried ones. People sensed something coming. Daniel himself sensed it too. His nights grew restless. He dreamed of his mother calling his name. He dreamed of blue eyes staring back at him from mirrors. He woke with his heart pounding and his fists clenched. One afternoon in late April Daniel was sent to repair fencing near the horse paddock. Ned Hartwell was riding nearby with friends. They laughed loudly, drinking from flasks, showing off. Ned spotted Daniel and smiled. He rode closer. "You there," he called. "Look at me when I speak." Daniel hesitated. Garrett noticed. "Look at him, boy," Garrett snapped. Daniel raised his eyes. Ned laughed softly. "Still got those eyes," he said. "Funny thing seeing them on you." Daniel said nothing. Ned leaned down in his saddle. "My father says you work hard. Shame that doesn't change what you are." Daniel felt something twist inside him. "Say something," Ned taunted. "Or are you too afraid?" Daniel looked away. Ned kicked his horse forward, splashing mud onto Daniel's clothes. The boys laughed. That night Daniel sat outside his cabin staring at the stars. Joseph sat beside him. "Careful," Joseph said. "Anger shows." Daniel nodded. But inside him anger was no longer something he could hide. A few days later Catherine summoned Garrett. She stood in the yard with her parasol and pointed toward Daniel, who was stacking crates. "That one," she said. "He lingers. Always watching." Garrett nodded. Daniel was whipped that evening. He did not cry out. The silence unsettled Garrett more than screams ever had. Word spread quickly. Something was wrong with Daniel. The final weeks before the killing felt stretched and unreal. Time slowed. Small moments took on strange weight. Edmund Hartwell noticed the tension. He avoided Daniel more than ever. He kept his eyes forward, his jaw tight. Once he passed Daniel in the yard and their eyes met. Just for a moment, Edmund looked away first. That look haunted Daniel. It haunted Edmund too. On the morning of the shooting, Daniel was assigned to carry crates into the storage shed near the main house. It was late afternoon by the time he finished most of the work. The cicadas screamed. The air was heavy and still. Daniel worked alone. He did not hear Edmund approach. The colonel stopped at the shed doorway and watched Daniel for a long moment. "You," he said quietly. Daniel turned. "Come here." Daniel obeyed. Edmund closed the door behind them. What happened next would be argued for years. Edmund claimed Daniel became threatening, that he feared for his life. Daniel never spoke again to give his version. Neighbors later reported hearing raised voices. One voice sharp and controlled, the other low and shaking. Then came the gunshot. People ran. Garrett reached the shed first. Daniel lay on the ground, blood spreading beneath him, his eyes open and unblinking. Blue even in death. Catherine arrived moments later. She looked once and turned away. Edmund stood frozen with the pistol in his hand. "It was an accident," he said. "Self-defense." The body was removed. The quarters fell silent. That night the plantation felt cursed. Whispers spread beyond Hartwell land. By morning the county sheriff arrived. Edmund was arrested. Charlottesville buzzed with rumors. An enslaved man shot by his master. Blue eyes. A mistress known for cruelty. A respected colonel in chains. The trial would expose everything. In the next part we will enter the courtroom where lies unravel and truth threatens to destroy the Hartwell name forever. If this dark chapter of American history has captured your attention, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Leave a comment telling us where you are listening from. And stay with us as the walls close in on Hartwell Plantation. Part 5. Some truths are worse than death. The morning after the shooting, Hartwell Plantation felt empty. The air itself seemed heavy, carrying the weight of eyes that could no longer look at anything without suspicion. The fields were quiet, the smoke from the chimneys hung low and gray, and the usual bustle of life in the quarters had been replaced with whispered fear. Daniel's blue eyes were gone, but their memory lingered. They haunted the corners of every room, every shadow of the plantation. People said they could still see him when the sun hit the windows just right. They said his gaze followed them. Edmund Hartwell had been taken into custody by the county sheriff. Word spread like fire through Charlottesville. A respected colonel accused of killing an enslaved man. The rumors didn't need proof. They had color, witnesses, and fear to fuel them. Catherine Hartwell walked through the main house as though nothing had changed. But the careful precision she always carried had shifted into something colder. Her hands trembled, barely visible to the servants, her smile never reached her eyes. The truth was coming, and she felt it like a winter wind slicing through her chest. The trial was scheduled for the first week of May. Every family in Albemarle County seemed to be talking about it. People whispered in markets, at church, at dinner tables. They speculated about what the Hartwells had done behind closed doors, about the eyes of the boy who had grown into a man, and about the power, privilege, and secrecy that allowed such things to happen. The courthouse in Charlottesville was a modest building, wooden and white, with tall windows that let in too much sunlight for anyone to hide. When Edmund Hartwell arrived, flanked by sheriffs, he looked nothing like the imposing planter who rode the fields daily. His posture was tight, his face pale, his hands fidgeted with the edges of his coat. He knew his world was collapsing. The courtroom filled quickly. White men of property sat in the front rows, talking in low voices. Women clutched fans, whispering, fanning themselves not from heat but from anticipation. Black faces lingered at the edges, eyes sharp, silent. Everyone knew what was at stake. The judge, an older man with a face like carved wood, called the room to order. He spoke with deliberate calm, but there was tension under his words. This trial was more than a legal matter. It was a mirror showing the rot of an entire system. The first witnesses were the overseers. Garrett, tall and lean, stepped forward, voice steady but eyes flicking nervously. He told of Daniel's work in the fields, of his obedience, of the slight missteps that had supposedly led to the confrontation. Every word was carefully chosen to frame the story in Edmund's favor, yet every sentence carried an unspoken weight, a hint that something had been wrong long before the gun went off. Then came the neighbors, people who had seen the Hartwell children playing, who had watched the interactions of the family and the enslaved people. Their testimonies were polite, detached, but their glances betrayed fascination, judgment, and fear. Blue eyes in a slave were not forgotten in Albemarle County. They were a secret everyone had known and no one had spoken of. Catherine Hartwell did not take the stand. She did not have to. Her presence was felt in every corner of the courtroom. Her hatred, her fear, her secrecy had shaped the events that led to Daniel's death. She sat in the gallery, fingers tight on her parasol, eyes hidden behind lace. People who knew her glanced her way, unsure if she would speak, unsure if she would unravel in public. Then came the testimony that changed everything. An older enslaved man, Joseph, was brought forward. He had worked alongside Daniel for years and knew more than anyone else about the dynamics of the plantation. His voice was low but steady. He spoke of Daniel's childhood, of the boy who had learned early to be invisible, of the labor he had carried, of the beatings he had endured. He spoke carefully of Ruth, of her love and her fear, and of the secret that had been passed to Daniel in whispered words, that the master was his father. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Joseph's words painted a picture no one wanted to acknowledge, that the life of an enslaved man had been shaped by betrayal, by desire, by cruelty, by the obsession of a woman who could not forgive the truth. He told of Catherine's constant watch, of her whispers to Garrett, of the ways she had made Daniel's life impossible. When he finished, there was silence. A long, uncomfortable silence. Edmund Hartwell's face was pale but unreadable. The jury shifted, restless. The people in the gallery stared at each other, unsure how to feel. Then the prosecution asked the hardest question. Did you ever see the mistress or the master express anger or hatred toward Daniel? Joseph's voice was steady. Every time she saw him, she hated him. Every time she saw him, she saw proof. Every time she saw him she wanted him gone. And the master, the colonel, he knew. Gasps moved through the courtroom. People whispered. Even the judge's stern face tightened. The defense tried to argue that Edmund had acted out of fear. That Daniel had threatened him. That it was self-defense. But the words felt hollow against the truth Joseph had spoken. Blue eyes could not lie. Blue eyes were proof. The trial dragged on for days. Witnesses came and went. Each testimony revealed more of Hartwell Plantation than anyone had wanted to see. The hierarchy, the cruelty, the secrets. Everyone was forced to confront the reality of power and ownership and the price paid by the enslaved. Outside, the town buzzed with speculation. Women whispered in kitchens. Men muttered at the market. Even children knew the story. Blue eyes, murder, wealth, betrayal. Inside the courtroom, Catherine's hand never left her parasol. Her eyes darted from Edmund to the jury to the gallery. Every question, every word, chipped away at her carefully constructed world. She had spent years directing her hatred and fear toward those who could not fight back. Now, for the first time, everything was at risk. On the final day, the jury filed in. Faces tired, serious, aware that what they decided would be remembered for years. The judge read the verdict slowly, deliberately. Each word hit the room like a hammer. Guilty or not guilty, the room held its breath. Edmund Hartwell, a man who had inherited land and wealth and power, now waited for the world to judge him in a way it never had before. Outside, the wind carried the smell of spring. The fields were alive with new growth. But Hartwell Plantation, and everyone who had lived there, would never be the same. In the next part we will explore the aftermath of the trial, the secrets that refused to stay buried, and the consequences that stretched beyond the walls of the courthouse into every corner of Virginia. If this dark story of betrayal and horror has captured your attention, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Leave a comment telling us where you are listening from and follow the tale as Hartwell Plantation faces its reckoning. Part 6. Some secrets are heavier than chains. The courtroom had emptied. The echo of the verdict lingered in the rafters, mingling with the smell of old wood and ink. Outside, the spring wind carried whispers across Charlottesville. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a memory of blue eyes staring back at them. Edmund Hartwell walked from the courthouse flanked by deputies. His face was pale, his jaw tight. Even his hands, usually steady, twitched slightly. He had survived wars, managed vast fields, and commanded respect across Albemarle County. Yet none of that could prepare him for the weight of what had been revealed in those small, tense days of testimony. Catherine Hartwell did not follow him immediately. She lingered at the courthouse steps, her parasol resting on her shoulder. Her fingers were white from gripping it so tightly. Her eyes darted over the crowd. Everyone knew what she had done. Everyone knew what she had allowed. She had been careful, meticulous, hiding her fury behind polite smiles and social rituals. But secrecy was no longer a shield. Daniel's memory was everywhere, in the minds of the jury, in the whispers of neighbors, in the way Garrett avoided meeting anyone's gaze, and in the quiet corners of the plantation, where the enslaved people spoke in low voices about the boy who had been more than a boy, a man whose life had been stolen before it began. Back at Hartwell Plantation, the fields seemed to sag under the weight of silence. The crops were growing, green and wild, but no laughter echoed across the rows. The cabins in the quarters were tense with unspoken conversations. Everyone knew something had shifted. Even the youngest children sensed it, though they could not name the reason. Catherine returned to the main house. She moved through the rooms like a shadow. The air felt colder. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows did not warm her. She sat in the parlor, staring at the floorboards, thinking about the blue eyes that had stared back at her for years. They were gone now, but they were not forgotten. Edmund arrived later that evening. He did not speak immediately. He placed his hat on the table and removed his coat, but his hands shook. He walked to the veranda and looked out over the fields. The plantation stretched wide, acres of tobacco and barns, paths lined with oak trees. Everything looked the same. Everything felt different. He thought of Daniel, of the boy who had grown into a man under his gaze. Of Ruth, who had loved him and protected him as best she could. And of Catherine, whose hatred had burned like fire, shaping every day of Daniel's life. That night the house was quiet. Even the servants moved softly, unsure what was coming next. Rumors had reached the quarters. The trial had changed the balance. The world beyond the plantation had seen the cracks in the Hartwell legacy. Catherine spoke first. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. It cut through the silence like a knife. "You cannot undo what has been done," she said. Edmund did not reply. He looked at her, eyes hollow. For the first time in decades, the control he had built over his world felt fragile. The next morning, the aftermath of the trial began to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. The local newspapers ran stories about the shooting. The town was divided. Some people claimed Edmund acted in self-defense. Others whispered that it was murder. Everyone mentioned the boy's eyes. Blue eyes. Proof. Evidence of the secret that no one wanted to see. Catherine felt it in every glance. The neighbors, the friends, even distant relatives looked at her differently. The polite nods were gone. There were questions in every smile. And she hated it. Hated that the world had caught a glimpse of the truth she had spent years hiding. In the quarters, the enslaved people whispered more freely now. They spoke of Daniel not as a boy, but as a man. A man who had carried the weight of a secret not his own, who had survived cruelty for years, and who had been taken from them violently. Their mourning was quiet, careful, but it was real. They remembered him with a reverence that terrified Catherine when she caught wind of it. The plantation itself seemed to mourn. The fields rustled in the wind, carrying the memory of Daniel's work. The barns held the echoes of his footsteps. Every creak of the house reminded Catherine and Edmund that nothing could ever return to the way it had been. Neighbors came to speak with Edmund privately. They whispered advice, some sympathetic, some accusatory. But all eyes lingered on him. They looked at him not as the master of Hartwell, but as a man who had been forced to face the consequences of his family's legacy. Catherine became more restless. She walked through the halls, tidying things that did not need tidying. She rearranged furniture. She polished silverware obsessively. Each action was a defense against the chaos that had entered her life. She could not stop thinking about Daniel. About the boy who had been her obsession. About the man whose death had unraveled everything she had built. Edmund and Catherine rarely spoke in those days. When they did, it was in clipped sentences, measured tones, carefully avoiding the words that could shatter the fragile peace. The tension in the house was palpable. Even the children felt it. Margaret, Ned, and Sarah moved quietly, aware that the world they had known had shifted, that secrets had surfaced, and that their parents were not the untouchable figures they had imagined. Meanwhile, the trial's verdict had stirred conversations in Charlottesville that reached beyond Hartwell Plantation. People debated morality, inheritance, the cruelty of slavery, and the price of silence. Questions lingered. How could a man like Edmund Hartwell be judged for what everyone already knew? How could a boy like Daniel be taken before his time, his life unacknowledged, his story buried in fear and hatred? Inside the plantation, the answers did not come. There was no solace, no comfort, only the shadows of what had been and what could not be undone. At night, Catherine dreamed of the boy. Blue eyes staring from the darkness, accusing, unyielding. She woke with her heart racing. Edmund slept fitfully, haunted by the memory of a gunshot and the consequences it had unleashed. The house itself seemed restless, walls holding secrets and whispers, floors creaking under the weight of grief and guilt. The community began to treat the Hartwells differently. Invitations were fewer. The polite conversation at church felt forced. Old friends avoided their eyes. Even the children noticed, though they did not understand why. Hartwell Plantation, once a symbol of wealth, power, and tradition, had been transformed into a place of fear. A place where the past could no longer be hidden. A place where one boy's life had changed everything. And Daniel's blue eyes, even in death, refused to fade. They lingered in the memory of every person who had seen them, a reminder that some truths cannot be buried, some horrors cannot be ignored, and some legacies are built on foundations too dark to withstand the light. In the next part, we will follow how the Hartwells confront the consequences of their secrets, the unraveling of the family, and the ways revenge and justice begin to creep into the plantation itself. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow this story to its chilling conclusion. Leave a comment with your thoughts and tell us where you are watching from. Hartwell Plantation's darkest hour is only beginning. Part 7. Some shadows do not fade even when the sun rises. Hartwell Plantation had changed. The air itself felt heavier, thick with fear, regret, and secrets that refused to die. The shooting of Daniel had left a wound deeper than any whip or punishment ever could. The fields continued to grow, the barns held their tobacco, and the family continued their routines. But underneath it all, something had shifted. Something invisible moved among the living and the dead, watching, waiting, whispering. Catherine Hartwell could feel it every day. In the early mornings when she walked the halls, in the quiet afternoons when she stood at the veranda, and in the evenings when the wind carried the faint echoes of laughter from the quarters that would never return. She could feel Daniel's eyes on her. Blue eyes that had burned into her memory, accusing, relentless, unforgiving. She tried to occupy herself. She polished, arranged, oversaw. But each task was meaningless. Each order she gave to Garrett or the servants felt hollow. She could not control the whispers in town, the sideways glances, the judgment that came in polite nods or forced smiles. Edmund, meanwhile, was quieter than ever. He moved through the house like a man haunted, eyes distant, voice subdued. He had survived battles, business disputes, and political rivalries, but nothing could have prepared him for the trial, for the public scrutiny, for the knowledge that everyone knew what he had tried so hard to hide. The children, Margaret, Ned, and Sarah, felt the tension too. Margaret no longer spoke freely to the enslaved children she had once played near. Ned's arrogance had faded into cautious observation. Even Sarah, still young, sensed the coldness in the house and avoided the rooms where her parents argued in whispers or sat in silence. In the quarters, life carried on. But there was a quiet rebellion in the air. The enslaved people who had worked alongside Daniel remembered him. They whispered his name in secret. They told stories of his strength, his intelligence, and the way he endured the cruelty of the plantation. Blue eyes that could not be hidden had left a mark on everyone who had seen them. Joseph, now older and more cautious than ever, had become a quiet leader among the quarters. He guided the others with a steady hand, teaching them how to protect themselves, how to survive, and how to honor Daniel's memory without bringing harm upon themselves. One night, a strange feeling settled over the plantation. The wind shifted. The shadows in the rooms seemed longer. Windows rattled even though no storm approached. Catherine was alone in the parlor, trying to read a book, but her eyes could not focus. She felt the presence of something that should not be there. She knew, without thinking, that Daniel's memory was watching. Outside, in the fields, Garrett worked alone, checking fences. He paused, feeling a shiver run down his spine. For a moment, he thought he saw movement in the corner of his eye, a figure standing among the tobacco plants. But when he turned, nothing was there. It was not the wind. It was not his imagination. The next morning, Catherine found one of the slave cabins empty. Not entirely, just a pallet rolled to the corner, a piece of cloth missing, a faint scent of smoke. She asked Garrett if anyone had seen anything. He shrugged. The other slaves were careful, quiet. They spoke no word that could be used against them. But Catherine felt it, knew it. Something was happening. Rumors began to reach the town again. People spoke of unrest at Hartwell Plantation. Strange noises. Doors opening on their own. Shadows that moved in the night. And always the mention of Daniel. Blue eyes. A ghost, they whispered. Edmund tried to ignore it. He worked in his office, examining accounts, making decisions, riding through the fields. But even he could not escape the feeling that something unseen followed him. Some nights he swore he heard whispers outside his window. Some nights he saw a flicker of blue in the darkness, just enough to make his heart pound. Catherine, unable to bear the feeling of being watched, began to take measures. She forbade the slaves from moving about after dark. She locked doors. She demanded that Garrett patrol the perimeter. But the fear was inside the walls now, and no amount of locks or orders could contain it. The community began to notice the change in the Hartwells. Visits from neighbors became infrequent. Invitations for Catherine to host or attend events were cancelled or politely refused. Edmund's business partners approached him with caution. Even the children's tutors noticed the strain and whispered their concerns. And in the quarters, the whispers grew bolder. Daniel's story was told and retold. It became more than memory. It became warning. Lessons for survival, yes, but also for justice. Not legal justice, which had failed, but a moral reckoning that no amount of wealth could erase. One evening, Margaret Hartwell saw something she would never forget. She had been wandering the veranda, gazing out at the dark fields, when she caught a glimpse of movement near the tobacco rows. She blinked, thinking her eyes deceived her. But then she saw it clearly, a figure standing tall among the plants. Eyes pale blue, piercing, unyielding. It did not move, but it stared straight at her. She screamed and ran inside. Catherine, hearing the sound, rushed to her side, scolding, demanding to know what had frightened her. But Margaret could only whisper, tears running down her face. Eyes. Blue eyes. Catherine felt her heart tighten. The memory of Daniel had become more than memory. It had become presence. That night, Edmund confronted Catherine in the study. His voice was low but sharp. "What have you done?" he demanded. "What do you mean?" she replied, trying to sound calm. "You know what I mean. The plantation is, it is not right. I feel it. The children feel it. The house feels it." Catherine's eyes narrowed. "It is nothing. You are imagining things." "Am I imagining?" Blue eyes, he said. "You saw them too, did you not?" Catherine said nothing. Edmund turned away. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. The control he had over the plantation, over his household, over his family, even over the law, was slipping. Something beyond his authority, beyond his understanding, was moving among them. Something that could not be bargained with. Something that carried the weight of injustice and death. Outside, the wind picked up. The trees whispered. The fields seemed to lean in closer. Shadows lengthened, reaching toward the main house. And in every corner, in every darkened room, the memory of Daniel waited. Watching. In the next part, the haunting of Hartwell Plantation escalates. The boundaries between the living and the dead blur, and the Hartwell family will confront horrors they cannot escape. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow the story as Hartwell Plantation unravels further. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. The ghost of Daniel is not done with the Hartwells yet. Part 8. Some sins cannot be buried. Hartwell Plantation had become a place of unease. The fields grew green, the barns stood solid, and the house appeared as it always had. Yet within those walls, and among the tobacco rows stretching toward the mountains, there was a tension that could not be named. The memory of Daniel hung in the air like smoke, invisible yet undeniable. Catherine Hartwell could feel it every day. She moved through the house carefully, aware of every creak, every shadow, every sound that could betray her to herself. She could not sleep at night without seeing his pale blue eyes in the darkness. They stared at her from corners, from windows, from places she knew should be empty. Edmund was no less haunted. He rode through the fields at dawn, trying to clear his mind, to organize his thoughts, to convince himself that life must go on. But he could not. Every rustle of the leaves, every whispering wind, felt like a reminder of the violence that had occurred, of the son he had never acknowledged, and of the consequences that were now impossible to avoid. The children sensed it too. Margaret stopped speaking freely to the servants. Ned became quieter, less sure of his authority, and Sarah, though young, began to avoid certain rooms in the main house. They were learning, in their own way, that the world was not as safe as they had believed. That the adults around them were fallible, fearful, and hiding something terrible. In the quarters, the whispers grew bolder. The enslaved people spoke of Daniel with reverence, telling stories of his strength, his courage, and the cruelty he had endured. They remembered how he had worked tirelessly, how he had survived the hatred of Catherine, how he had carried the burden of knowing who his father was. One night, the plantation was silent. The wind had died down, and even the animals seemed subdued. Catherine walked through the halls, checking the locks and windows, trying to convince herself that she could keep control of her world. But when she passed the main staircase, she saw it. A shadow moving at the edge of the light. A flicker of pale blue. She froze, heart pounding, unable to breathe. Edmund was in his study when he heard the first scream. It came from Margaret's room. He rushed through the house, finding Catherine standing in the hallway, pale and trembling. Margaret clung to her mother, eyes wide with terror. "Blue eyes," she whispered. "I saw him." Catherine's face was white. She could not speak. She knew what Margaret had seen, what the child could not understand. Daniel's presence had returned, more real than ever, and it was not limited to memory. Over the following days, strange occurrences multiplied. Doors opened and closed on their own. Objects moved inexplicably. Shadows flickered in empty rooms. Servants whispered of hearing Daniel's voice calling from the fields at night, though no one dared go outside to confirm. Edmund tried to rationalize it. He told himself the stress of the trial, the fear of public opinion, the weight of guilt, were playing tricks on everyone. But deep down, he knew better. There was something beyond explanation here. Something that had been wronged and refused to rest. Catherine became more desperate. She sought the advice of distant relatives, even consulted a local preacher. She tried prayers, blessings, anything to cleanse the house of what she feared. Yet nothing worked. The plantation was alive with the memory of Daniel, and it seemed to grow stronger every day. The town began to take notice. Visitors to the Hartwell estate commented on the strange behavior of the family. Neighbors whispered about shadows moving in windows. The children's unusual fear was remarked upon politely, though curiosity glimmered behind polite smiles. In the quarters, Joseph organized the enslaved people carefully. He warned them to be cautious, to respect the memory of Daniel, but also to remain vigilant. There was a sense that Daniel's spirit, or whatever force lingered, was protecting them in some way, guiding them silently, reminding them of injustice and survival. One evening, Margaret could not sleep. She wandered to the veranda, staring out at the fields. There, in the dark, she saw a figure standing among the tobacco rows. Eyes pale blue, glowing faintly in the moonlight. She froze, unable to speak, unable to move. It was as though Daniel had returned not as a boy, not as a memory, but as a sentinel watching over the plantation, and perhaps judging it. Catherine saw her standing there. She ran to Margaret, pulling her inside, scolding her, yet terrified herself. The child's words could not be ignored. Daniel's presence had returned, undeniable, relentless, and it would not leave until the truth had been confronted fully. Edmund finally understood what he had been avoiding for decades. His wealth, his land, his reputation could not protect him from the consequences of his actions. The murder, the secret child, the cruelty, all of it had left a mark that no power or money could erase. As days passed, the Hartwells could feel the walls of the house tightening around them. Rooms felt smaller. Every step echoed in a way that reminded them of what had been lost. They were prisoners of a guilt that could not be named and a presence that could not be ignored. And in the quarters, the enslaved people felt it too. The power of Daniel's memory, of his impossible blue eyes, gave them courage. They began to speak more freely, to assert small acts of defiance. They moved with purpose in the fields, cared for one another, and held the memory of Daniel as a shield against the cruelty that remained. One night, as a storm approached, the family gathered in the main hall. Thunder shook the windows. Lightning flashed across the sky, casting the house in eerie light. Catherine and Edmund stood together, silent, while the children clung to each other in fear. Outside, the wind howled through the fields. In the distance, the faint glimmer of blue eyes seemed to watch them, waiting. It was clear that Hartwell Plantation would never be the same. The past had returned with a force stronger than any whip or authority. Daniel's life, his suffering, and his death had changed everything. The family could no longer hide from what had been done. The enslaved people could no longer remain entirely powerless. And the land itself seemed to remember, carrying the weight of guilt, horror, and justice across every field, every barn, every cabin. In the next part, the haunting grows more intense. The Hartwells face the consequences of their actions in ways they never imagined. Secrets long buried will rise. Justice, vengeance, and reckoning will collide under the shadow of Hartwell Plantation. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow this story to its chilling conclusion. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. The spirit of Daniel is no longer bound by memory. If you want, I can immediately write part 9 and 10 next so the story has a complete dramatic and viral ready ending for YouTube. Do you want me to do that? Part 9. Some truths cannot be ignored. Hartwell Plantation had become a place of restless shadows. The wind through the trees whispered secrets that no one dared repeat aloud. The house groaned under the weight of guilt. The fields stretched like green oceans toward the mountains, but their beauty could not erase the darkness that had settled over the land. Catherine Hartwell could feel it in every step. Every room she entered seemed smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves remembered Daniel. Every time she moved, she felt his eyes on her, accusing, relentless. Her control, the thing she had clung to for decades, was slipping. She was trapped in a house haunted not by spirits, but by the truth of her own actions and the consequences she had tried so hard to ignore. Edmund walked through the plantation like a man wandering in a dream. The trial, the whispers, the public scrutiny had left him hollow. He tried to focus on his work, on maintaining the fields, the tobacco, the business deals. But the presence that lingered in every shadow, every corner, would not allow it. He could feel Daniel's memory following him, judging him silently, a living testament to the sin that had begun years ago with betrayal and cruelty. The children sensed it too. Margaret had become withdrawn, haunted by a fear she could not fully explain. Ned, once full of arrogance, now watched the adults with caution and suspicion. Sarah, the youngest, sometimes spoke in whispers to the empty rooms, as if she could hear Daniel answering back. Their innocence was slipping away, replaced by a knowledge of evil that children should never carry. In the quarters, the enslaved people moved carefully. Joseph kept watch, guiding the others with quiet strength. They whispered of Daniel constantly, sharing memories of his courage, the kindness he had shown, the endurance he had displayed in the face of Catherine's hatred and Garrett's cruelty. To them, Daniel had become more than memory. He had become a symbol, a force that reminded them that no cruelty could erase a human soul. One stormy evening, the plantation felt alive in a way that was terrifying. Lightning slashed the sky, casting long shadows across the main house and the tobacco fields. The wind howled through the trees, shaking the windows and rattling the doors. Catherine sat in the parlor, her hands gripping her chair, unable to move. She could hear whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves, voices speaking in a language she could not understand, yet somehow knew. Edmund joined her, his face pale. "We cannot ignore this," he said quietly. "Whatever is happening, we must face it." Catherine shook her head. "Face it," she whispered. "There is nothing to face. It is just memory." "It is not memory," Edmund replied. "It is justice. It is the truth that refuses to be buried." That night, strange events escalated. Windows opened without wind, doors creaked on their hinges. Objects moved, shadows shifted, and in the tobacco fields, the faint glow of pale blue eyes appeared again. Always watching, always present, Margaret woke screaming, claiming she had seen Daniel in her room. Ned refused to sleep in his bed, insisting he felt someone standing over him. Even Sarah spoke of a boy with blue eyes who walked silently among the fields at night, leaving no footprints, saying nothing, yet commanding attention. Catherine's fear reached a new height. She consulted neighbors discreetly, hired a local preacher, and tried rituals she had read about to cleanse the house. Nothing worked. Whatever was present refused to leave. It was not vengeance in the ordinary sense. It was reckoning, a force that demanded acknowledgement and truth. Edmund, for his part, realized that no power, no status, no wealth could undo what had been done. The murder, the betrayal, the cruelty, all of it had left a mark on the plantation, on the family, on the land itself. He could no longer hide behind authority or tradition. Every corner, every room, every field reminded him of Daniel and the consequences of his choices. The community of Charlottesville began to notice the change at Hartwell. People whispered of strange happenings, of shadows in the windows, of unexplained noises. Visits dwindled. Invitations disappeared. The Hartwells, once a respected family of influence, were now subjects of fear and speculation. In the quarters, Joseph and the others found courage in Daniel's memory. They began to move more freely, to speak in hushed tones about the injustices they endured. They held small acts of defiance, guided by the spirit of the boy who had lived, suffered, and died. His memory became a quiet rebellion, a reminder that even in death, the powerless could leave a mark on the powerful. One evening, as the storm returned, Edmund and Catherine stood together on the veranda. Lightning flashed, revealing the vast fields stretching toward the horizon. And there, for a brief moment, in the center of the tobacco rows, a figure appeared. Pale blue eyes glowed in the darkness. It did not move, yet it held their attention with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. Catherine trembled. "The boy is here," she whispered. "He always has been," Edmund said softly. "And he always will be, until we acknowledge everything." The realization hit them both. The haunting was not random. It was a demand to confront the past, to face the truth of their actions, to reckon with the life they had taken and the lives they had controlled. Daniel was no longer just memory. He was justice in motion, a presence that reminded them that no wealth, no power, no lies could erase the consequences of cruelty. In the quarters, the whispers grew louder. The enslaved people felt a shift in the air, a sense that the reckoning was reaching its peak. They remembered Daniel as he had been, as he should have been. They honored him quietly, knowing that the plantation, the family, and the land itself were all bound to his memory now. The storm passed, but the sense of unease remained. Hartwell Plantation would never be the same. Shadows lingered in rooms, whispers floated on the wind, and the glow of pale blue eyes haunted the fields long after night fell. In the next part, the haunting reaches its climax. The Hartwell family will be forced to confront the full consequences of their actions. Secrets will be revealed, justice will demand recognition, and the true horror of Hartwell Plantation will be laid bare. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow this story to its chilling conclusion. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. The reckoning is almost complete, and Daniel's eyes are still watching. If you want, I can immediately create part 10, the final climactic part, with a dramatic, chilling, and viral-ready ending for YouTube. Do you want me to do that next? Part 10. Some horrors cannot be contained. Some truths cannot be silenced. Hartwell Plantation stood in the pale light of dawn, the air thick with tension and the promise of reckoning. For years, the estate had been a place of secrecy, betrayal, and cruelty. For years, the shadow of Daniel, the boy with impossible blue eyes, had haunted its halls, its fields, and its people. And now, in the spring of 1851, the consequences of every injustice, every act of cruelty, every buried secret, would collide in ways no one could escape. Catherine Hartwell awoke with a start. The memory of Daniel's eyes had returned in a nightmare so vivid she could feel them on her skin. She saw him in the corner of her room, pale and silent, watching her. Her heart pounded, and a cold sweat covered her forehead. She tried to convince herself it was just fear, just guilt manifesting in dreams, but she knew better. Daniel's presence was no longer something that could be ignored. Downstairs, Edmund moved quietly, sensing the change in the air. The plantation was no longer merely his property. It had become a place alive with judgment. Every step he took felt heavier, every room whispered reminders of the sins he had tried to hide. The trial, the whispers in town, and the memories of the boy he had refused to acknowledge were all coming to a head. The children sensed it too. Margaret had become pale and withdrawn, Ned silent and restless, and Sarah clutched her doll as if it could protect her. The air around the house was suffocating, charged with the presence of something beyond their understanding. Something demanding justice. Outside, the enslaved people in the quarters moved cautiously. Joseph gathered them quietly, warning them to stay inside until the storm passed. The wind carried an unnatural chill, and the sense that something unseen had come to claim its due was palpable. They whispered Daniel's name, speaking to the memory of the boy who had suffered so much. His story had become their shield, their strength, and now, his presence was unmistakable. As the first thunder cracked across the sky, a scream echoed from the fields. Catherine ran to the veranda, heart racing. There, in the midst of the tobacco rows, stood a figure bathed in the pale light of dawn. Blue eyes. Pale blue eyes that pierced the soul. Not a shadow, not a memory, but something alive with the weight of justice and vengeance. Edmund followed, and even he could not deny what he saw. The figure moved with a slow, deliberate grace, not running, not attacking, yet demanding attention. The boy was no longer a child. He was something more, a force that carried the pain, anger, and endurance of a lifetime of cruelty into the present moment. Catherine tried to speak, to command, to assert her authority, but the words failed her. Fear had rooted her to the spot. The figure of Daniel raised a hand, not threatening, but accusing. Every act of violence, every moment of injustice, every cruelty Catherine had inflicted upon him and his mother was reflected in those glowing eyes. Edmund stepped forward, his voice trembling. "We cannot undo what has been done," he said. "We must face it." The wind howled, the sky darkened, and then, in a moment that seemed both eternal and instantaneous, the truth poured into the Hartwell home. Secrets that had been hidden for decades were revealed in whispers, in shadows, in the undeniable presence of the boy who had been denied a life he deserved. Catherine fell to her knees, sobbing. She could no longer deny what she had done, what she had allowed, and what she had perpetuated. Her cruelty, her hatred, her complicity in a system built on the suffering of others had returned to confront her. Edmund knelt beside her, grief and fear etched into his face. He had lived a life of power and privilege, but none of it mattered now. He had to reckon with the consequences of his actions, with the life he had taken from Daniel before it even began. In the quarters, Joseph and the others watched from a distance. They felt a strange peace in the air, a sense that Daniel's presence had not come merely to haunt, but to balance the scales. The boy who had been powerless in life now carried a power that could not be denied. The children, finally understanding in their own way, huddled together. Margaret whispered his name. Ned bowed his head. Sarah clutched her mother's hand. They had witnessed a reckoning beyond their comprehension, a moral truth that no amount of wealth or social standing could suppress. The storm passed, leaving an eerie calm. The figure in the fields vanished, leaving only the memory of eyes that had seen everything and judged it all. The Hartwells were left shaken, humbled, and forever changed. They had survived the storm, but their lives, their hearts, and their conscience would carry the weight of that day forever. Hartwell Plantation would never be the same. The house, the fields, and the quarters would hold the memory of Daniel for generations. His eyes, impossible and unforgettable, had forced justice in a world where the law had failed. In the end, it was not wealth, power, or tradition that determined the fate of the Hartwells. It was truth, endurance, and the indomitable spirit of a boy who could not be erased. As the sun rose over Albemarle County, the Hartwells faced the dawn with the knowledge that their actions had consequences. They had been judged, not by the courts, not by society, but by something far older, far more powerful. And it was a reckoning they could not escape. Thank you for following the story of Hartwell Plantation. If you felt the tension, the horror, and the weight of history, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more dark historical stories. Share this video with friends who love mysteries that chill and thrill. And leave a comment below telling us where you watched from. Did you feel Daniel's eyes watching you too? The story may end here, but the memory of Hartwell Plantation and its secrets will linger. Remember, some truths are too powerful to stay hidden, and some eyes never close.